Hello, I'm Floyd Stokes, your instructor for AJ2, Introduction to Law Enforcement at College of the Redwoods. These series of PowerPoint videos are meant to give you an audio-visual overview of each chapter of the text, but you will still need to thoroughly read each chapter. Today I want to discuss Chapter 3 of our text, which is titled Law Enforcement Agencies and Their Organization. This chapter has 3 learning objectives. 1. Describe the organization and roles of federal and state law enforcement agencies. 2. Summarize the differences between police departments and other types of organizations, and describe both traditional and contemporary approaches to organization. And 3. Summarize the trends and issues associated with private policing. Now let's get started. The federal government has a number of its own enforcement agencies, as does each state government. Additionally, county and municipal level agencies can be all across the country, including specialized agencies that don't necessarily fit neatly into any government category. Counting the number of law enforcement agencies in America is not unlike counting the number of citizens. One credible estimate is more than 20,000 federal, state, and local agencies employing some 680,000 sworn personnel. That translates into roughly 1 sworn law enforcement officer for every 457 people. Most arms of the federal government have at least some enforcement component. 2 examples would be the Criminal Enforcement Division of the IRS, or Internal Revenue Service, and the Office of Law Enforcement of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Even the various branches of the military have their own law enforcement sections. After the September 11, 2001 attacks, it was found that most government enforcement agencies were scattered across the federal government, making it difficult for widespread collaboration and interagency communication. The Homeland Security Act of 2002 created the Department of Homeland Security, known as the DHS. It is a cabinet-level department. A list of these agencies can be found on page 37 of the text, and this slide shows the major federal agencies. The Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, now either houses a number of agencies that were once part of other cabinet-level agencies, or it is the head of other newly created agencies. 3 examples would be the U.S. Coast Guard, which was moved from the Department of Transportation, the TSA, which was newly formed after 9/11 under DHS, and the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, or FLETC as it's known, which trains federal officers for a number of agencies. And the Federal Protective Service is also now under DHS. 3 other major federal agencies were either moved to the DHS or restructured under the DHS. The Secret Service used to be housed in the Treasury Department based on its primary role of working to suppress counterfeit currency. Since September 11, 2001, it was moved to DHS but continues to work against counterfeit operations. Other duties include protection of the President, First Family, and other federal officials. Customs and Border Protection, or CBP as it's known, was established after September 11, 2001 to control and protect America's borders and ports of entry. Its primary concern is combating terrorism, but also to facilitate legitimate trade and travel. A well-known component of this agency is Border Patrol, which is one of the largest uniform law enforcement agencies in the U.S. Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, known as ICE, is similar to CBP but more focused on illegal immigration investigations. Incidentally, it's the largest investigative component of DHS. It should be clear why the Homeland Security agencies I've just discussed are housed where they are. Each has a unique opportunity to target terrorists and otherwise break up terrorist plots. Agencies under the Justice Department before 9/11 experienced some reorganization in the names of their various departments, but their functions largely remained the same. Why are the FBI, the U.S. Marshals Service, the ATF, and the DEA in the Justice Department? Well, primarily because of the 1870 Act to establish the Justice Department, which tasked the Justice Department to conduct the country's legal business, especially regarding prosecution of criminal activity. At that time, the Justice Department was given full control over all federal law enforcement. Of course, things have changed since 1870, and now there are law enforcement agencies, bureaus, and officials throughout the federal government. But the agencies listed above will likely remain in the Justice Department for the foreseeable future. Another important agency that falls under the Justice Department is the Federal Bureau of Prisons. So we're going to take a look at the Justice Department for a few slides. The Federal Bureau of Investigation remains the U.S. Department in the U.S. Department of Justice, but its mission has changed to some extent as a result of 9/11. Its mission now is to, quote, protect and defend the United States against terrorist and foreign intelligence threats, unquote, as well as to enforce the criminal laws of the United States and provide liaison in the form of legal attaches to other countries. It heads the Joint Terrorism Task Force. It is to the federal government what state police agencies are to states, what sheriff's departments are to counties, and what municipal police departments are to cities. It is, in short, the investigative arm of the U.S. Department of Justice. The FBI has jurisdiction to enforce more than 200 categories of federal law that proscribe all sorts of criminal activity. As of 2010, the FBI employed more than 33,000 people, including about 13,500 special agents. The agency's budget for fiscal year 2003 was about $8 billion. An organizational chart of the FBI is shown at the bottom of page 40. The U.S. Marshals Service is America's oldest law enforcement agency. Marshals were key law enforcement officials in the Old West, as I mentioned in Chapter 1, but at the turn of the 20th century, their responsibilities started to shift. Today, there are more than 3,300 deputy marshals throughout the United States, even in the Eureka area. They work for 94 presidentially appointed U.S. Marshals, one for each federal district. The agency's main responsibilities are federal security and fugitive investigation. Marshals work in task forces alongside local law enforcement agencies to apprehend fugitives. Its Special Operations Group is similar to a police agency's SWAT team. As for witness security, the agency has protected, relocated, and given new identities to nearly 8,000 individuals. It works with customs enforcement and immigration officials to more effectively deport criminal aliens. Marshals are also responsible for housing more than 50,000 federal detainees. The Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives Agency is basically a tax collection, enforcement, and regulatory arm of the U.S. Department of Justice. Unlike the FBI and the USMS Marshal Service, the ATF has not been housed in the Justice Department for long. On January 24, 2003, it was transferred from the Department of the Treasury to Justice in accordance with the Homeland Security Act. Even though the explosives component has been added to its duties and is a key concern, it is still known as the ATF. It deals with licensing and inspecting all manufacturers, importers, and gun dealers. It employs both special agents, who are both criminal investigators and enforcement officials, and inspectors, and it investigates explosives and arsons. Finally, the agency regulates distilleries, wineries, breweries, and, of course, tobacco manufacturers and retailers. The Drug Enforcement Administration is tasked with enforcing controlled substance laws and regulations. The agency brings to justice people and organizations involved in the illegal growing, manufacture, and distribution of controlled substances. I believe all of you know about the DEA and its activities from news and media accounts, but you can read more about its functions on page 41. The DEA is one of the larger federal law enforcement agencies. In 2010, it employed nearly 11,000 people, including more than 5,200 special agents. The agency has 227 domestic offices in 21 divisions throughout the United States and in 63 foreign countries. Most state agencies were initially created for a specific purpose. The Texas Rangers, for example, were established in 1835, even before Texas attained statehood, and functioned largely as a military organization responsible for patrolling the Republic's borders. Massachusetts was the second state to create a law enforcement agency in the United States. It was developed with the intent to target vice crimes. Today, numerous state agencies exist. Table 3.1 on page 42 shows the number of personnel employed by state law enforcement agencies is significantly less than the number employed in local police departments. State law enforcement agencies are usually organized according to one of two models: a centralized model or a decentralized model. A centralized model means the tasks of major criminal investigations are combined with the patrol of state highways. Other key components include assisting local law enforcement departments in criminal investigations when asked, operating identification bureaus, maintaining a centralized criminal records repository, patrolling the state's highways, and providing select training for municipal and county officers. The Oregon State Police would be an example of a centralized model. A decentralized model means central governments exercise relatively few powers and in which the majority of police services are provided by separate local and regional agencies. Other key components include more traditional municipal police agency, generally found in the southern portion and some midwestern portions of the U.S., and it draws a clear distinction between traffic enforcement on state highways and other state-level law enforcement functions. What state would have a decentralized model? Well, the California Department of Justice and the California Highway Patrol fit this model. A local agency refers to municipal, which means serves a municipality, and sheriff's departments, which would serve a county or parish. So you'll find parishes on the southeast and the east coast, as well as campus, state parks, and so on. Eureka Police Department would be an example of a local police department. Police chiefs are usually hired under contract and serve at the pleasure of the city council or the city manager. Figure 3.6 on page 46 and figure 3.7 on page 47 show examples of municipal police department organizational charts. Sheriffs are elected officials. Sheriff's departments generally are responsible for serving civil process in the county. They provide bailiffs for the courts and they run the county jails. They also provide patrol services in unincorporated areas, as well as search and rescue efforts. The Humboldt County Sheriff's Office is an example of a local sheriff's department. Section 3.2 on page 48 looks at the differences between police departments and other types of organizations. On page 49, it describes both traditional and contemporary approaches to organizations. Police departments differ from other organizations in that they are public agencies, which means they are funded with taxes. They exist within a political environment. They work in the public eye and must follow rules applicable to government agencies. They are not for profit, and they are often hamstrung by bureaucratic rules and regulations. Like most public agencies, police organizations have limited resources. They often had to pursue grants and other sources of what is known as soft money, which would be funding apart from their year-to-year budgets, just to make ends meet. Many private companies have no shortage of cash in the bank, and when they don't have the money they need, they can take out loans. This is not a luxury available to public sector organizations. Although parent governments can borrow typically through the issuance of bonds, it's not something that you see for police departments usually. Law enforcement organizations also differ from other types of public and private organizations because the people who work in them generally fall into one of two categories: staff or non-sworn personnel, and line officials, which are sworn officers or deputies. A distinct chain of command is usually established in most law enforcement agencies, and the text covers more details about chain of command in law enforcement agencies and rank structures and so on. The functional structure of a command chain incorporates the notion of what is known as span of control, which refers to the number of subordinates supervised by one person. The bigger the organization and the higher up a ladder a person ascends, the greater that person's span of control is. The traditional approach to police organization hails from Sir Robert Peel's recommendation that police agencies must be stable, efficient, and organized along military lines. But because few police organizations follow the military model in every detail, they are often said to be quasi-military or paramilitary in structure. Peel's advocacy of the military model was echoed by O.W. Wilson and other influential figures in early American policing. But what is the logic for this model of organization, and what makes the paramilitary model so desirable? To answer these questions, we need to look beyond policing to the realm of organizational theory, particularly to the legacy of two key individuals, Frederick E. Taylor and Max Weber. Taylor studied organizations for the purpose of improving worker productivity. During his time, people often worked to the point of exhaustion, and people worked ineffectively. Taylor's contribution was in the area of increasing worker productivity through careful attention to how work was allocated and who performed what functions. Max Weber is widely recognized as one of the first people to study bureaucracy. He did not invent bureaucracy, nor is he responsible for all the negative connotation the term takes on today. But he did identify 5 principles that he suggested are characteristics of an effective bureaucratic organization. These principles can be applied to law enforcement, and here's what they are. Well-defined hierarchy of authority, in other words, a chain of command. Specialization, in other words, tasks are divided by precise, routine specialties. Formalization, in other words, a system of rules and regulations. Impersonality of management, in other words, decisions are made objectively regardless of rank or personality. And lastly, personnel decisions are based on merit. In other words, positions and promotions are based solely on merit rather than how long a person has been there, longer than time. Does this sound like a typical police agency? The answer is most certainly yes. The classical model of police organizations has its limitations, and critics feel that this approach is mechanistic, meaning that the people element is separated from the command structure. The contemporary model, on the other hand, is viewed as organic, which means the organization is like a living, breathing entity made up of real human beings. Applying this thinking to policing, an organic organizational structure would elevate the status of line officers by giving them some control over the organization's mission. Advocates believe that this is a more flexible and adaptive method or organization. Contemporary theory emphasizes participatory management, which allows subordinates to participate in decision-making, and it focuses on contingency theory, which recognizes repetitive and non-repetitive tasks, allowing for regulation and flexibility based on problem-solving and decision-making scenarios. The final approach to organizational style considered in this chapter is the systems perspective, which strives for a state of equilibrium or balance that can affect or be affected by environment. Well, the police are not the only ones in the business of crime control and prevention. Public police, such as municipal police officers, sheriff's deputies, state troopers, and so on, work alongside scores of private police and security officers. People employed as private police officers or security personnel outnumber public police officers by 3 to 1. The number of companies engaged in providing private police or security services has been estimated at more than 10,000, and they employ more than 500,000 personnel, including more than 10,000 store detectives, nearly 100,000 managers and staff, and nearly 400,000 security officers. It is useful to distinguish between private security and private policing. Private security refers to the industry that provides, quote, for-profit security products and services, which include 3 broad categories: guards, equipment, and investigation or consulting services. Private policing, on the other hand, refers to the acquisition and use of these products and services for security, crime prevention, and crime control. The text compares public policing and private policing as follows. Public policing focuses on right versus wrong and enforcing public policy. It also focuses on detection, apprehension, and punishment. It deals with public justice. Punishment depends on the law. It is concerned with the protection of public property and the general public. Whereas private policing focuses on loss prevention, it focuses on prevention, not punishment. It focuses on private justice, in other words, punishment is up to the discretion of the business, and is concerned with protection of private property and clients. Finally, this chapter discusses some controversies in private policing, which is but one part of a larger privatization movement in criminal justice. For example, private prisons have emerged to provide presumably cost-effective alternatives to state-run correctional facilities, and that is presumably. Perhaps the most significant controversy associated with private policing deals with constitutional concerns. In general, because private police are non-governmental, they are not bound by the same legal requirements as public police. So here are 3 questions for you to be thinking about. 1, is the criminal justice system becoming a for-profit venture? 2, is private policing replacing public policing? And 3, what happens to constitutional concerns? Well, to summarize this chapter, there are roughly 20,000 law enforcement agencies in the U.S. Most federal agencies are part of the Department of Homeland Security and Department of Justice. Most state agencies follow a centralized or decentralized model. Local law enforcement agencies consist mostly of municipal police departments and sheriff's office. Law enforcement organizations differ from other organizations in two ways. They have line and staff personnel, and most follow a quasi-military command structure. Private police officers are hired to serve a client's interests, and thus their priorities differ from those of public police. There is controversy over whether private police can be regarded as governmental actors for purposes of the law. Before I close, be sure to read page 53 of the text that discusses Joe Arpaio, America's toughest sheriff. We'll discuss this issue further in class. Well, that's it for this chapter. We'll see you in class.